We ask you to settle in. This one runs long. And it deserves the time. At 41 years old, Verity Coe stood on the courthouse steps of Salt Hollow, Arizona Territory, with $11 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt, and nowhere on this earth she could rightly call home. It was her husband's brother, Thaddeus Coe, who had put her there, riding onto the ranch not 3 weeks after Elias was buried, waving a paper of debts she had never seen and a claim of kinship rights she could not read well enough to argue against. And by sundown she was walking the road with a trunk, a shawl, and whatever coin she'd hidden from him in time. $11. That was the whole of her fortune. So when the auctioneer, half joking, offered up the wreck rights to that fool stagecoach wedged in Widow's Canyon wall, sold as is, sold for nothing, sold to whoever's fool enough to want it, she raised her hand before she'd even decided to, and paid $6 of her $11 for a heap of splintered wood that no living soul had touched in 22 years. The whole street laughed. But what none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that lodged inside that ruined coach, tied fast beneath its driver's seat, was a secret that would not only change the shape of her life, but would set right a wrong that had been quietly poisoning this town since before she was born. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Verity Coe. If you're watching tonight from a place that feels forgotten, a town, a name, a piece of yourself folks have written off, tell us in the comments. Because this story is for you. Verity had not always been a woman with $11 to her name. She had been raised on a modest spread outside of Prescott, the third of 5 daughters to a blacksmith named Josiah Merrill and his wife Ada, a woman who kept bees and mended harness leather with the same patient hands, and who had taught her daughters that a thing broken was not a thing worthless. It was only a thing waiting for someone with the eyes to see what it could still become. It was Ada who taught Verity to read a ledger, to follow a column of figures the way another woman might follow a hymn. And it was Josiah who taught her the quieter trade of the forge, how iron remembers its shape, how rust is only a kind of forgetting that heat and patience can undo. Verity had a gift, even as a girl, for finding value where other people saw only ruin. She would walk home from market with a cracked clock someone had left for the ragman, or a chair with a broken leg. And by winter it would be ticking on the mantel or holding her mother's mending basket, restored not by money but by attention, which Verity had always understood to be the rarer currency. She married Elias Coe at 19, a rancher's son with a gentle laugh and a bad head for business. And for 2 decades they built a modest cattle operation in the grasslands east of Salt Hollow, a town that had grown up around a silver strike and stayed on after the silver thinned, sustained by cattle, freight, and the stubbornness of people who did not care to be told twice to leave a place. Verity kept the ranch's books, doctored its sick calves, and quietly, without much notice from her husband or his kin, became the reason the operation survived 3 lean winters that would have broken it under a less careful hand. She had no children of her own, a private grief she carried the way she carried everything, without complaint, folded small, and put away. What she did have was a reputation, modest but real, as a woman who could look at something nobody else wanted and see what it was worth. It was this reputation, ironically, that made Thaddeus Coe move so quickly once Elias was in the ground. He knew his sister-in-law was no fool, and he did not want her poring over the ranch's books long enough to notice that the debts he claimed were mostly debts of his own making, incurred at faro tables in Tucson and covered, quietly, against his brother's good name. He came with a lawyer's letter full of words designed to frighten rather than inform, and Verity, grieving and outnumbered, did not have the fight left in her to demand the accounting she was owed. She signed what she was told to sign. She packed what fit in the trunk, and she walked away from 20 years of her own labor with a straight back and a silence that cost her more than anyone watching could have guessed. She came to Salt Hollow because it was the nearest town of any size, and because a woman alone in that country needed people around her, even indifferent ones, more than she needed pride. She took a room above the seamstress's shop, paid for by piecework mending, and she told herself, the way people do when the alternative is unthinkable, that something would turn up. What turned up on a hot Tuesday in the spring of 1889 was a courthouse auction, the county selling off odds and abandonments to cover unpaid claims. Everything from a dead man's mule harness to the rights of salvage, on an old stagecoach wreck that had sat wedged in a canyon wall since before most of the men bidding on it had grown their first mustache. The story of that coach was one every child in Salt Hollow had heard around a fire at least once, though none could swear to its details. In 1867, a territorial mail-in payroll, run bound for the soldiers at a distant outpost, had vanished into Widow's Canyon during a spring flash flood. The driver and team never accounted for, the strong box of Army payroll gold, presumed lost to the water along with them. Some years later, a boy hunting doves had spotted, high up on the canyon's north face, wedged into a crevice the flood must have carried it to, and the years had since sealed shut with rockfall and brush, the unmistakable shape of a coach's broken wheel. Nobody had ever climbed up to confirm it properly, and nobody had ever much wanted to, since the canyon wall was treacherous. The coach was assumed stripped of anything of value by whoever had caused the wreck in the first place, and the county had long since written off the payroll gold as a loss the Army itself had stopped chasing. The wreck rights, when the auctioneer called them, were a joke lot, tacked onto the end of the sale to get a laugh and a few coins for the county coffers. Verity raised her hand not because she believed in treasure, but because $6 felt, in that moment, like the only kind of gamble left open to a woman with no other cards to play. And because some old instinct in her, the same instinct that had once seen a cracked clock and known it could tick again, told her that a thing left alone for 22 years was not the same as a thing with nothing left to give. Men on the courthouse steps laughed at her the whole walk back to the boarding house, and Warrington Ashgrove, the town's banker, a soft-spoken and impeccably dressed man who held the note on half the businesses in Salt Hollow, laughed loudest of all, calling out that she'd bought herself a fine mountain view for $6 and precious little else. Verity said nothing. She had learned in her marriage and in her eviction both that silence kept more dignity than argument ever could. It took her the better part of a week to arrange the climb, since no man in town would take payment to help her, some out of superstition about the canyon, most simply believing it a fool's errand not worth their time, until she found Tobias Reyes, a young vaquero recently arrived from Sonora with a mule, a length of good rope, and none of Salt Hollow's inherited opinions about the wreck or about widows who bought wreck rights. Together they climbed the switchback trail on the canyon's south face and worked their way along a narrow game path to where the coach hung, wedged nose first into a crevice some 80 feet above the canyon floor. Its wood gone silver gray, one wheel shattered, its body tilted at an angle that made Tobias mutter a prayer under his breath before he'd even touched it. Inside, the coach was mostly as the flood in the decades had left it, a rotted mail sack, the brittle bones of a leather satchel, glass long since fallen from its windows and scattered somewhere below. But it was Verity, running her hand along the underside of the driver's bench out of the same careful habit that had once found value in cracked clocks, who felt the seam that did not belong there, a false bottom, built into the bench itself, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff as bark and tied with cord that had somehow, in the dry mountain air at that height, survived where lesser things had not. A strong box no bigger than a bread loaf, and beside it, folded flat and just as carefully preserved, a leather-bound ledger. She did not open the strong box there on the ledge. 80 feet up with the wind pulling at her skirt, and Tobias watching with wide, uncertain eyes. She wrapped both parcels in her shawl, lowered them to the canyon floor on the rope, and did not breathe easy until she and Tobias and the coach's secret were all three back on solid ground, sitting in the shade of a mesquite tree with the sun going long and gold across the canyon rim. The strongbox, when she finally worked its rusted latch loose with a hairpin and a prayer of her own, held gold specie, army payroll, unmistakably dulled by time but whole. More money than Verity had seen in her whole married life laid out at once. But it was the ledger that made her sit very still for a long while, because it was not a payroll record at all. It was written in a careful aging hand, and it was a confession, asterisk. The ledger belonged, as its first pages made clear, to a man named Cornelius Ashgrove, the father of the very banker who had laughed at Verity on the courthouse steps, and it laid out, in the plain, unadorned language of a man easing his conscience before death, the true history of the 1867 robbery that Salt Hollow had spent 22 years believing was an accident of flood and fate. There had been no accident. Cornelius Ashgrove, then a young freight agent with access to the payroll manifest, had arranged with 2 hired men to waylay the coach in the canyon during the spring flood, timing the theft to be swallowed by the very weather that would make it look like nature's doing rather than man's. The plan had gone wrong when the flood came harder and faster than expected, sweeping the coach itself into the crevice where it still hung, drowning one of the hired thieves and stranding Cornelius Ashgrove on the canyon rim with nothing to show for his scheme but the knowledge of where the gold had gone and no way to retrieve it. And to cover his part in it entirely, Cornelius Ashgrove had let the blame fall on the coach's driver, a freedman named Solomon Vance, hired only the season before, who had no kin in the territory to speak for him and no standing in a town quick to believe the worst of a black man with an empty payroll and a dead partner as his only witnesses. Solomon Vance had been tried within a month, on evidence that amounted to little more than his absence and his color, and hanged before the spring was out. His name entered into Salt Hollow's memory as a thief who'd gotten what was coming to him, when in truth he had died for a crime committed by the grandfather of the man who now held the note on half the town. Verity read that ledger twice through by lantern light that night, and did not sleep at all. She might, in a weaker or more desperate hour, have simply taken the gold, said nothing of the ledger, and built herself a quiet new life somewhere the name Coe meant nothing and the name Ashgrove meant even less. She thought of it, she would later admit, thought of it the way anyone starving thinks of bread that isn't rightfully theirs. But Ada Marrow's voice was in her still, the old lesson about a thing broken not being a thing worthless, and it seemed to Verity, turning the ledger's brittle pages under lamplight, that Solomon Vance's name was the most broken thing in that whole canyon, more broken even than the coach itself. And that gold spent quietly on herself while his memory rotted unclaimed in the town's ledgers would make her know, better than the man who'd buried the truth in the first place. She learned, through careful and quiet asking, that Solomon Vance had left behind a young daughter, sent in his final weeks to relatives in California, and that the daughter, now a woman near Verity's own age named Ruth Vance Freeman, had years ago returned east to Salt Hollow's outskirts, working as a laundress, and never once, in all that time, telling her own children the details of the grandfather they were taught to be quietly ashamed of. It seemed to Verity a monstrous kind of theft, that on top of a man's life, this family had also been robbed of the simple right to say his name without lowering their eyes, when word got out, as word does in a town, the size of Salt Hollow, that the widow Coe had found something worth having in that old wreck. The mood shifted fast from mockery to something colder and more interested. Warrington Ashgrove came to her boarding house room himself, still soft-spoken, still impeccably dressed, offering in the politest terms imaginable to spare her the trouble of dealing with the county and the army, both, and to purchase whatever she'd found for a fair price, no questions needed on either side. Verity understood, watching his hands as he spoke, that he had not seen the ledger and did not know what she knew. He simply feared, on old family instinct, that anything pulled from that particular wreck might carry the smell of a past his father had spent a lifetime burying. She told him she would think on his offer. What followed was 3 weeks of a quiet, ugly kind of pressure that Verity recognized from her own eviction, dressed up now in a town's collective politeness. The county recorder, a man beholden to Ashgrove's bank for the mortgage on his own house, suddenly discovered irregularities in the wreck-right sale and suggested the whole auction might need revisiting. 2 of the boarding house's other tenants found reasons to avoid her at the supper table. Tobias Reyes, who had climbed the canyon with her and asked for nothing but a fair day's wage, was quietly informed by the livery owner that his mule might no longer be welcomed aboard there. Verity understood exactly what was being done to her, because it was the same slow strangling of options that had been done to her at the ranch, only now with a whole town's machinery behind it instead of one brother-in-law's lawyer. She might have folded. She had folded once before, after all, signing papers she hadn't the strength to fight. But this time she had something Thaddeus Coe had never let her have, proof, in a dead man's own careful handwriting, of exactly whose sins were being covered and exactly whose name deserved washing clean. And she had, too, something she had not had at the ranch, a reason bigger than her own survival. She went first, not to Warrington Ashgrove, but to Ruth Vance Freeman, finding her at the washing lines behind her small frame house on the town's forgotten south edge, and told her everything, the ledger, the confession, the true name of the man responsible for her father's death. Ruth Freeman, a woman who had spent 30 years teaching her children to say as little as possible about their grandfather, sat down hard on an overturned washtub and wept in a way Verity suspected she had not allowed herself to do in decades, not from grief alone but from the strange, disorienting relief of finally being believed. It was Ruth who told Verity, once she'd found her voice again, that the town's old Methodist chapel, the only building in Salt Hollow that had stood open to black and white and Mexican families alike back in her father's day, and the closest thing to a schoolhouse the poorer families on the south edge had ever had burned 2 winters back and never been rebuilt, the county claiming no funds for it, the Ashgrove Bank quietly declining every request for a rebuilding loan. Verity understood, hearing that, exactly what the payroll gold was for. She brought the ledger to the county judge herself, a cautious but not dishonest man named Elmore Tate, along with 2 independent witnesses, Ruth Freeman and the elderly former freight clerk, who had worked alongside Cornelius Ashgrove in 1867 and had always harbored his own quiet doubts he'd never dared voice against a family with the bank's power behind it. Judge Tate read the confession 3 times before he spoke, and what he said, in the end, was that a dead man's written word, corroborated by 2 living witnesses in territory freight records that still existed to check the manifest dates against, was as fine a piece of evidence as he'd seen cross his desk in years, and that Solomon Vance's name would be formally cleared in the county record. The first such reversal Salt Hollow had ever seen. Asterisk. Warrington Ashgrove did not go to prison, for his father's crime was not legally his to answer for, and Verity, when the moment came, found she did not want vengeance so much as she wanted the truth spoken plainly, and the harm undone where it could still be undone. But the bank's reputation, once the ledger's contents became known, and Judge Tate, to his credit, made certain they became known, reading portions aloud at the county hearing with the courthouse doors open to any who cared to listen, never fully recovered its polish. And Warrington Ashgrove spent the remainder of his years in Salt Hollow a quieter, more careful man, no longer laughing loudest at anyone's expense. The payroll gold, Once the Army's regional quartermaster confirmed it had long since been written off the books and formally relinquished any claim, became Verity's by every right the county could grant her, and it was hers too, by the harder right of having climbed 80 feet of canyon wall to find it. She kept enough to buy back, in full and outright, a small parcel of her old ranch land from Thaddeus Coe, who by then had drunk and gambled away enough of his ill-gotten inheritance that he was glad of her money and asked no questions about where it had come from. The rest, the greater part of it by far, she put toward rebuilding the burned chapel on Salt Hollow's south edge. Not as a chapel alone this time, but as a proper schoolhouse too. Open the same as the old one had been to any child in town, regardless of the color of their people or the thinness of their purse. With a modest brass plaque set beside its door, bearing the name of Solomon Vance, driver, wrongly accused. Rightly remembered, Ruth Freeman's grandchildren were among the first pupils to sit in that schoolhouse's new pine desks. And it was Ruth herself, in the end, who asked Verity to stand beside her the day the plaque was unveiled. Two women, neither of them born to privilege, standing together in the shade of a building raised from gold that had waited 22 years in a canyon for someone with the patience to go looking. So we come back, as we promised, to where we began, to a woman of 41 with $11 to her name, standing on a courthouse step while a whole town laughed at the $6 she'd spent on a wrecked coach nobody else wanted. What none of them understood that day, and what Verity herself could not have known, was that she was not buying wreckage at all. She was buying the chance, one more time in her life, to do what her mother had taught her at a mending basket and a forge, to look at a thing everyone else had written off, and see instead what it still had left to give. The coach gave up its gold, yes, but the truer treasure sealed inside it was a dead man's name. And the truer restoration was not Verity Coe's fortune, but a whole community's overdue reckoning with a debt of memory it owed and had never paid. That is the story of Verity Coe, a woman cast out with almost nothing, who found 80 feet up a canyon wall, exactly enough to set an old wrong right. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Verity's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs reminding that value hides in the places pride overlooks. And we'll leave you, as we often do, with a question worth sitting with a while. What is a time you found real worth in something, or someone, that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close, **.